Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us Frederico Gil and he's a senior country economist at the World Bank. And more importantly, he just released about 2 days ago an Indian economy update, which he does twice a year. Gives you an idea of where the Indian macros are headed, the macroeconomic numbers are, where they're headed, in which direction is the economy going. So we have Frederico with us to sort of to analyze and to further break down some of his findings. Welcome to our show, Frederico. Nice to have you. So tell us your latest Indian economy update. It says India is doing well relative to others, although the term that you use, which I find interesting, is that in spite of stalled engines like agriculture or private investment, we are still, Indian economy is still expanding. So what's your read? I mean, how do you think is the economy expanding in spite of these very critical engines which appear stalled? Like agriculture, we have two drought years, very bad. Agriculture growth last 2 years has been virtually 0.3% or something, right? So private investment yet to pick up. So do you think it's the public investment which is sort of lifting the economy or what?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think that what we see from the data is that the main force driving growth in India last year from the consumption side was really the urban consumers.
Okay.
A lot of factors have played into that. You have credit growth. I mean, our report talks about the financial sector and the concerns about slow credit growth to businesses, but actually there has been pretty robust credit growth to individuals and personal loans for buying durable goods like cars, refrigerators. And it usually tends to be urban consumers, urban families.
But overall
that are more
credit growth?
To credit.
Overall credit growth?
Overall credit growth, is middling.
It's middling.
Middling, but on the personal credit growth side is fairly strong. Inflation coming down, that tends to benefit, at least what the data says that has benefited more the urban consumers. And also the kind of sectors of the economy that are growing, manufacturing, services, those are sectors that are creating jobs in urban areas. So the main kind of driver of growth for India has been the urban side. And it's true enough on the rural side that we see a lot of stress, but it's also true that rural households have become a lot more diversified. They still depend mostly on agriculture, but the data that we have looked at show that they're actually deriving more income from non-agricultural sources, and that helps keep things up.
But are you a bit worried that rural wage growth is, some say, close to zero and maybe negative, which used to be like 17-18% 4 years ago?
Yes, no, that is something that concerns us because that was a way that got a lot of people out of poverty was through these growth in rural wages, people going into construction, people going into, again, non-agricultural roles in rural areas. So that is something of a concern, and this is why in terms of the outlook for this year, we're hoping that with the monsoon normalizing, that some of the agricultural wages pick up, and along with the agricultural wages, the rural wages overall also pick up.
So, Frederico, tell me, if some of these engines don't start firing, like agriculture or private investment, how long can just urban consumption fuel growth? Does it have its limit, or do you expect that? And your forecast, I noticed your forecast for the next for the year following 2017-18, 18-19. You are a bit conservative. You're saying 7.7, 7.9. You're not really sort of even hitting 8%, I noticed.
But if you look at what's happening in the global economy,
that's what I figured that. Maybe you're taking the global headwinds into account, as it were, right?
Definitely, because my colleagues from our development prospects group, they also come out every 6 months with a report on global economic prospects. And in fact, they just downgraded the growth of the world economy this year by half a percentage point from 2.9
down to 2.4, right?
To 2.4, exactly. So from that perspective, in terms of the difference in growth rate in India versus the world, I think that we remain quite kind of favorable on the path of the Indian economy. But you're right. I mean, I think that we certainly expect that for this momentum to continue. First of all, we are expecting the monsoons to actually bring a better agricultural production this year.
Yeah.
I think that some of that is already
Off
started.
a low base, maybe you could get 4, 5, 6%.
You could get, even if you get
there.
about 3.5% agricultural growth, right there you have, 0.4 percentage points bump to GDP. Of course, on the other side, you're going to have the loss of the oil shock. So government is going to find harder to finance the expansion in infrastructure spending. A lot of the private sector that was actually rebuilding their balance sheets are going to be a bit squeezed in terms of profits from the oil side, but hopefully that can be compensated by a better agriculture. But in the longer term, I think that we want to see a continuation of the reforms that are going to raise productivity.
Okay.
So things like the GST, I think that there's some...
Or the bankruptcy law, the new bankruptcy law.
The bankruptcy code, I think, is very important. I think that will take a couple of years to really kind of materialize. It needs to be challenged and tested.
Yeah.
But, just bringing together and creating more certainty around the, insolvency is going to be something that is very important. Yeah. So those things we hope are going to bring back the investment in the medium term. Also, the infrastructure investment of the center. There is evidence that this crowds in private investment. A lot of the private investment needs to be connected to roads, to ports. So these investments that the government's putting up now, we also hope that they'll pay off in higher.
So you're hoping that the big investments in roads, railways, etc., will eventually crowd in private investment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me, Frederico, there's a big worry about, there's a big debate in India as to how insulated are we. Some say India is not so connected with the global economy. I personally believe that we are fairly connected. If you add import and exports, we are like 45% or thereabouts, aggregate if you. So there's a hope that, recession in Japan, Europe, generally always shaky. United States recently getting a little shock about the employment growth figures, right? So all put together, and as you said, your own global economists within World Bank downgrading growth. Is that a worry? Is that if it is, how much of a worry is it for India? How much can India sort of ring fence itself, as it were?
I think that you're right, and I think that it goes back to your earlier question about why if India really has a potential to maybe be growing 8, 9, 10%, why are we thinking something closer to 7.5 to 8? And I think that part of that is because India is not entirely insulated from what is happening in the global development. If you look at the period that India was growing very rapidly in the early part of the 2000s, 2003, 2004.
Other emerging markets are also growing.
And exports were growing very fast.
25%.
Exactly.
Year after year.
Exactly. So I think that India can get away with growing very fast without exports for 1 or 2 years. But if this situation, the global economy continues, I think that will make it more challenging for India. And also in terms of private investment.
And also China is the elephant in the room.
So. Exactly. So private investment, there's a lot of excess capacity. There's a lot of excess capacity in China. So until growth in China stabilizes and some of that excess capacity works itself out.
Yeah. So how long will that take to play out, the Chinese overcapacity, which is a big worry for us here?
Oh, that's something that is tough for me to answer.
Because I also read some reports that the Chinese government, since they do everything on a big scale, they were talking about destroying some of their overcapacity. How are they going to sort of scale back some of their overcapacity? How do you do that?
I think that the overall story in the Chinese economy is still a positive one. I think that the kind of the 10-year story in the Chinese economy is definitely a positive one. So I think that capacity will eventually find its use.
So water will find its own level
without destroying it. But I think that it means that it will take some time. I can't precise whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 3 years.
Destroying means what? Shutting down? Is that what they're talking about?
I mean, that's how it already works when capacity, when things are operating below capacity, usually means
you shut it down.
Yeah.
So tell me, Frederico, I want your take on this debate which is ongoing and not ending in India, which is about the GDP numbers. Now, where do you stand? The RBI governor, who has a lot of credibility, is finishing his term. He also has spoken about problems with the numbers, although methodology is fine. I mean, it's a tested methodology. The IMF, World Bank, they've all endorsed that methodology. But within that, when the numbers come, you see margin of errors, in the methodology expanding. The latest numbers show some nearly 50% error margin, and then you see things like some big parts of the service sector like finance, real estate, where the at current prices the GDP growth is lower than in constant prices. So you see these paradoxes. How do you read the GDP numbers?
I mean, it's certainly very.
And also, by the way, if you go by gross value add GVA for 2015-16, it's 7.2%. Now, most people find that number more credible than the other number, the 7.6, which was released, So.
No, I think that first of all, I agree with what the RBI governor said, that the methodology is well established. We have confidence in the numbers that the CSO puts out. I think that the truth is that the Indian economy is both, very large, very complex. A lot of things are happening in the informal sector. So it is an intrinsically difficult task. I have a lot of sympathy for the folks at the Central Statistics Office who are trying to put that together.
Yeah, which has a lot of credibility. The CSO also does a lot of good work. NSSO is also a very good statistical body,
So I think that we have to look at the whole set of things. We have to look at what is in the value-added side. We have to look at what is in the demand side and recognize that these things, especially when they first come out, that some of this kind of uncertainty is natural when the data first comes out.
Okay.
I think that what we do see from the different directions, and if you look at the value-added or the GDP side, is that there was a pickup in momentum of the economy in the last quarter. We saw that to some extent the lower oil prices were also helping the industry side to raise the value-added.
The increase in value-added growth was largely because commodity oil price went down, so your value add increase in terms of...
That's one reason, but I think that the other reason that I also saw some commentators mention, and to me I think have a lot of credibility, is that the new database that CSO has been using, this RBI database, which actually has a lot of thousands of unincorporated firms. There's a lot more happening in India unincorporated that sometimes escapes the view. People very focused on the stock market.
Which data is kept by the Company Affairs Department.
Exactly, and this data is now being used. So we now have a more complete data set that is being used by CSO.
Okay.
And I think that a lot of that may not be as visible to us, but India is such a vast place that I think that is actually, there's some truth to that. There's some truth to the fact that the oil price have been helping. But overall, I think that the economy is moving on the right track.
Why people somewhat become, why people have become skeptical about the GDP data is, for year 2013-14, which was by consensus considered the worst year of growth, it was I think 4.7% or something. As per the new data series, that also got bumped up to 6.9, nearly 7%. So the experience of the ground, which is what Raghuram Rajan, our RBI governor, keeps saying, the experience of the ground does not fully correlate with the numbers. For instance, in the past when we had 8% GDP growth, 7.5 to 8% GDP growth, we had exports firing away at 20% plus. We had industrial growth also nearly at double digit, bank credit at 20% plus, right? So some of those numbers somehow don't correlate.
But this is, I think that part of the reason that this may not be felt on the ground is that it's coinciding with this decline in prices or this slowdown in inflation. So you take credit growth, for example. It's true that credit growth has been declining, but once you adjust it for inflation, the fact that a lot of credit is for working capital. So as inflation comes down, the need for working capital credit also comes down. So credit growth in real terms, for example, has been a lot more stable than if you just look at it in nominal terms. So I think that there's, I'm not doubting the perceptions, but I think that sometimes the perceptions are also influenced by this kind of low price environment that has happened in the last year.
Sure. Now, Frederico, you are also tracking the 14th Finance Commission and the fallout of 14th Finance Commission, the manner in which states are getting more discretionary kind of funding, untied funding. So how do you view this center-state fiscal kind of interface happening post 2017, when the distinction between plan and non-plan will also disappear? So center and states would probably work more as partners. So how do you see that process?
So this is also a big transition that we want, as you say, to keep track. So we saw what was in the budget last year in terms of how the government planned to implement the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. And then we wanted to see, now that the revised estimates have come out, exactly how did the different states fare, and did states actually receive additional resources? And then what did they do with the additional resources? So we looked at the budgets of about 20 states, and at least according to the budgets, most of the states actually, or actually all of the states, according to their budgets, got additional resources.
Even some states which had earlier had apprehension that they won't get more, they have ended up getting
according
more.
to their budget documents, which is what we looked at. They actually receive additional resources between the because sometimes the slice of the pie might have become smaller, but the pie was so much larger that even your smaller slice of the pie actually contained more pie. And I think that this was the case, for example, for Bihar.
And you've also given some numbers on how states have actually managed to increase their spend on education and not so much on health, though, you say, as per your...
And infrastructure as well. So well, I think that we'll need to see over a couple of years, because this was a transition year. It wasn't clear how much the states were going to receive from the center in terms of the grants. You recall that the centrally sponsored schemes, they were being restructured, and a final decision just came out in November. So I think that this is very much a transitional year, and we'll wait to see a couple of years.
So you'd have to see a kind of number of years to see how these expenditure patterns post-14 Finance Commission will pan out.
But at least in the first year, one of the things that we were concerned, for example, is will the states actually reduce their own revenues? Right? So you're getting more for the center, then you don't need to collect as much on your side. At least for the first year, we did not see that. And that's something that we hope will continue.
Possibly post-GST, the pie may even increase as more, as some of the non-formal or the black economy also is brought into the tax net, right?
But this is why GST is so appealing, and why economists are generally very much in favor of the GSTs. That is one of the few taxes that businesses actually have an incentive to register for that tax.
Tell me, Frederico, tell me what is your view, or how does the World Bank look at the actual spend in India on, say, things like education, health, even law and order? If you look at the numbers, like Thomas Piketty was here and I had met him, I had a chance to talk to him, and he said that India is, on health, is one of the lowest, it's, even on law and order, if number of police personnel per, say, 100,000 population, it's very low in India. So how do you see, do you think there's scope really to spend a lot more in these areas?
I think that there's scope for both. I mean, I think that there's scope for more spending, but I think that there's also scope for spending better. Because if one looks, for example, at the spending on education, and one looks at the outcomes from some of the standardized tests of how much the children
education
are learning,
outcome is very poor.
The correlation between spending and outcomes is not there. And in fact, according to at least some of the statistics, the performance of the students has been declining. And I think that it's very important to focus on improving the quality and keeping the states. Holding the states accountable for improving the quality. But then at some point you will need more resources. I mean, I think that in absolute terms, thinking again about a longer period of time, 5 to 10 years, India certainly would look to spend more in places like health and education, social protection. But it's also important that even the existing spending is optimized so that you get more.
So is this also part of the quality of spending? Is that you track, is as part of your India economy update, you track that also?
We are tracking that out of kind of other stream of work. In the update, we only have the direction of the spending itself.
But going forward, it might be useful that if you give some qualitative data also on outcomes of some of these spends in health, education, etc., as part of your India update. I mean, is that?
Thank you for the suggestion. We are keeping track of that, so that's something that we should certainly consider including it in the next one.
Okay. Now, tell me, you also track the fisc, right? Now, how do you see India's fiscal consolidation program at present? Because on paper, the number is fine. We are actually reducing our fiscal deficit to GDP. But of late, there are some worries that a lot of off-budget items are cropping up. For instance, some of the pay commission obligations, some of the obligations towards ex-servicemen not fully accounted for. I am also told that food and fertilizer subsidies have actually got carried over, in the sense they have not been paid, but they have not been shown. So it's kind of, expenditures got postponed, and that's nearly 1 lakh crore plus. This was told to me by the agriculture economist Ashok Gulati on this show. He was here 2 weeks ago. So if you take all that, and if you take some of the bonds being issued to state governments for power sector dues. So, altogether, what picture do you see?
I'd like to make 2 points on the fiscal situation. I think that first of all, it really sent a very good signal that the government decided to stick
about
to
that
the,
there's
to
no
the
doubt,
deficit
yeah.
target.
Because
there was a debate. There was a debate. I mean, I'm sure that you recall that some people were pushing to say, no, the economy, because of all the headwinds, what we discussed earlier, you should not try to stick to the 3.5. You should be a bit more relaxed. So I think that
I'm part of that camp, more relaxed, Yeah.
But they sent the signal that they wanted to stick to the 3.5. Now I think that the challenge is for them to really try to surprise on the tax front, and to actually stick to what they put in the budget with respect to the auction of cellular spectrum, as well as the divestments, because there will be a lot of pressure just from what is already in the budget. I'm not entirely familiar with some of the things that might crop out inside the budget, but of course, even just meeting what is in the budget, I think that it will require a lot of discipline from the government on the revenue side, and also to look at what are the expenditures. Fertilizer subsidies would be a good candidate where things can be further rationalized.
And this time the finance minister doesn't have the luxury which he had in the previous year, 2015-16, when oil prices fell and he could take credit for an extra 100,000 or 140,000
on the excise
crore.
On the excise take,
yes. That luxury doesn't have. On the contrary, oil prices are actually moving up. So he may have to reduce excise if he's not to increase oil prices further, which is politically very hot in this country. Since the entire fall in oil prices was not passed on to the consumer, barely about 30% were passed on. So now there is a hue and cry. The opposition is very alert to how much oil price would be increased as prices go up. So I think there's a problem there. Yeah.
No, I think that certainly will make it challenging, but I think that India has a lot of room to improve its direct tax collection. If you look at the number of taxpayers, I think that we're looking at 3.5 crore taxpayers. I think that there is a room for the revenue department to increase collections of personal tax, as well as corporation tax, and maybe surprise on the upside on those areas to compensate a little bit for the loss.
And the sale of public sector company shares by the government, is that possibility, do you think, exists?
Well, that's part of from what I understand, that's the divestments that have been placed in the budget. I mean, I think that it's important to think about.
I mean, can they do more than what they budgeted and surprise on the upside there also? I mean, do you think?
I haven't been following closely, but I think that what is important is to think about a long-term strategy for the different sectors where the state has investments, and that the divestment is not purely about raising funds, but it's also about making those sectors more effective and more productive for the economy.
Okay. So, so overall, tell me, so are you hopeful that the Indian economy will fire from all the cylinders, say 1 year from now, especially once Chinese overcapacity works itself out or some of the global conditions improve? Is that a precondition, or do you think on its own it will fire?
I think that on its own, for the Indian economy can continue to do reasonably well, but I think that it can actually reach even higher growth rates if the global situation normalizes. I mean, one of the analysis that we did is to see how much of the the downturn in Indian exports have to do with India losing competitiveness or just the global situation. And it turns out that it's mostly the global situation. So if global demand comes back, I think that engine can start firing again in terms of exports. Service exports continue to be a very strong area. In fact, if you look at, it's one of the very few IT exports, it's still one of the very few areas that are growing in terms of India's exports. So with a global demand, let's say in the next 2 to 5 years recovering, I think that actually has some upside potential for India. But domestically, it's also going to be important to continue with the reforms so that people feel confident investing here, so that you have infrastructure, you have certainty of regulation. Those things are going to be very important.
And finally, I forgot to ask you the big question of the banking sector. There are huge bad loans, NPAs sitting out there, yet to be resolved, and some say they're nearly about 14% of our total credit. So Raghuram Rajan was looking at it, but now he's leaving. So do you expect that could prove to be a constraint on higher credit, higher growth?
I mean, I think that it's already proving to be a constraint on higher credit, and I think that there are a lot of efforts underway in terms of trying to resolve some of these NPAs. What we think is important, going back to one of your earlier questions, is to also look at the specific sectors where some of those NPAs were coming from. Yeah. So you mentioned the power sector and the Udai scheme.
Roads,
road, highways, that's another one.
General infrastructure,
General infrastructure. So I think that making sure that some of the underlying causes, so on the distribution sector, that the distribution losses, I mean, that's something that everyone should be really, following up very closely, and there should be a lot of kind of real-time tracking. That are the discoms really reducing these losses, because otherwise it's just going to eventually come back, and then it ends up as an NPA in the bank's balance sheet.
We'll end up in a vicious cycle rather than a virtuous cycle.
Exactly, because I think that there is an opportunity for a virtuous cycle, but I think that for that a lot of attention needs to be put to reducing those losses.
Thank you very much, Frederico, for talking to us. So that was Frederico Gil Sander, Senior Country Economist at the World Bank India office. So we'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.